You are listening to Chapter 2, Lesson 2 of Form 3 Cameroon History. Cameroon General Education. Narrated by Wacheseh Academy. How the Germans penetrated the interior of Cameroon and problems encountered in the course of penetration. After the Germans took control of Cameroon in 1884, they started extending their rule into the interior. Dr. Eugene Zintgraff. He played an important role to carry out German influence from the coast until the interior of Cameroon. He traveled from Douala to Barambai, where he set up the first German administrative headquarters. From Barambai, he traveled through Mukanji, Ikilawindi, and Ngudi to Banyong country, Mamf. From there he continued through Ashong and arrived in Bali in January 1889. In June 1889, he left Bali and continued through Mankan and Baffa to Adamoa, where he was received by the Emir of Yola, but did not succeed to sign a treaty with him. Having failed at Yola, he returned to Bali. T.R. Koons and Lieutenant Tappenbeck. He exploits regions in south and central Cameroon. They started the journey inland from Big Batanga in October 1887 and were faced with the Bokoko resistance. In 1888, they finally arrived Yaoundé, where they opened the first inland German station. The Yaoundé station later became very important to the Germans. Its central position made it possible for it to serve as a trading center in the interior, military station, and served as the German capital for some time. Kurt Morgan and von Stetten. They began their journey in Yaoundé in 1889 and explored the northern parts of Cameroon. Between 1889 and 1894, they had covered the entire Anguilla, Yoko, Tabati, Banyo, and Ibi in the north of Cameroon. Their activities in the north was not an easy one based on the resistance they faced from Nyandera and also from the French around the Lake Chad region. Major Hans Dominic. He was a military officer who arrived in Cameroon in 1894 from Germany. Immediately after he arrived in Cameroon, he was given the task of setting up a military camp in Yaoundé. This camp acted as a military center to suppress all anti-German revolts. He used his soldiers to suppress the Bula resistance in 1999, the Bamilike, the Fulb, and the North. In 1904, he established a military garrison in Garua and another in Mora in the north. Problems encountered by the Germans in the course of penetration into the interior. 1. Political and administrative. The British non-recognition of the Germans as the colonial master of Cameroon. To overcome the problem, Bismarck campaigned for an international conference on colonialism to be held in the German city of Berlin, where policies were put in place concerning Africa. The problem of acquiring Victoria from the British. The Germans negotiated and bought Victoria. Inadequately trained administrators to administer the territory. To solve this problem, the British made use of traditional rulers who assisted them. Absence of geographical maps and poor knowledge of the people and places in the interior. To overcome this, many German explorers were sent to explore the interior. The hostility of natives and anti-German revolts. To overcome this, the Germans used their military expeditions and brought the people under German rule. The strong English influence along the western coast of Cameroon. To overcome this, they abolished the Court of Equity set up by the British and created the Cameroon Council presided over by a German. 2. Social problems. The territory was plagued by tropical diseases such as malaria, filaria, sleeping sickness, yellow fever, etc. To overcome this problem, they established hospitals, brought in German medical staff and drugs which provided good medical care. The problem of harsh tropical climate, especially excessive heat, strange to them. To overcome this problem, the capital of German Cameroon was transferred from Douala to Bia. They faced communication problems with the natives. To overcome this problem, the natives were taught in German schools. They made use of interpreters and translators. The problem of accommodation with maximum security. To overcome this problem, houses were constructed using stones and bricks. The problem of obtaining good drinking water. To overcome this, spring water projects were executed and pipe-borne water made available. 3. Economic problems. A harsh physical environment such as hills, thick forests, rivets, etc. Making movement very difficult. To solve this problem, forced labor led to the digging of footpaths, roads, etc. Poorly developed transport infrastructures and facilities. The Germans constructed roads, bridges, railways, brought motor vehicles, etc. Poorly developed communication infrastructures. Introduction of postal services, telephones were introduced. Inadequate finance to run administration and development. Money was raised directly and indirectly through taxes, plantations, etc. Problems of acquiring land for plantation. It was solved by land expropriation of native lands. Shortage of laborers to work in the plantations along the coast. To solve the problem, laborers were conscripted from the interior. Scarcity of good food for European consumption. They introduced the cultivation of new crops, vegetables, etc. Native resistance. Some tribes such as the Bakweri led by Chief Kuva Laiknai, Bangwa by Chief Asanganyai, Duala by Manga Bell, Bulu by Martin Paul Samba, etc., revolted against the German colonial rule for so many reasons. 1. Economic. They hated the German policy of forced labor. They hated to serve as German porters and carriers. They hated German interference in their trade. They hated the heavy taxes imposed by the Germans. They hated the maltreatment of workers given by the Germans. 2. Social. They hated the German policy of flogging in public. They were not happy with German interference with their culture. They resented the immoral behavior of the German traders towards native women. The Germans opposed some of their old traditions like polygamy. 3. Political. The people hated the appointment of chiefs. They hated the German policy of creating paramount rulers and spreading their influence to neighboring tribes. Reasons why native resistance failed. The Germans fought the natives with professional soldiers, unlike the natives who had local weapons. The Germans had well-trained workers unlike the natives. The natives lived in small scattered villages, and it was easier for the Germans to defeat one village after the other. Some natives collaborated with the Germans, and this made it difficult for the natives to win. The level of nationalism among the natives was very low. Most were not united. The natives were unable to secure the support of foreign powers against the Germans. The natives were too poor to fight a prolonged war against the Germans. Most of the native fighters were farmers, hence they could not abandon their farms for long. Consequences of the natives' resistance. Many natives lost their lives and property. The Germans burnt down some houses in the villages, seized their domestic animals, etc., which brought misery to the natives. The natives were forced to pay fines such as cattle, elephant tusks, which increased their misery. The defeated natives lost more lands to the Germans. The natives had to take an oath of loyalty to the Germans. The local chiefs who led their subjects against the Germans suffered detention or were exiled. It led to the establishment of military posts or stations to prevent native revolt or revenge. It generated intertribal hostility between chiefs who were for and those who were against the Germans. Natives were brutalized by the Germans, and this made them support the Allied powers against the Germans during the First World War.